Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. Formula 1, the pinnacle of four-wheeled racing. What more is there to say? Like many people, F1 was my first introduction to motorsports, and at this point, I've been following it for close to 2 decades. During this time, many things have changed, including a massive boom in popularity. However, the basic recipe is still the same. The fastest race cars, with the best teams and drivers in the world, competing for honours on the global stage. Like Formula 1, Gran Turismo has been an almost ever-present thing in my life, and on numerous occasions, the two have overlapped. In a franchise that aims to represent racing and car culture, there was no way that it was going to be ignored. But as Gran Turismo has never held the official Formula 1 license, this has always presented a unique challenge. So, much like I've already done with endurance, rally, and oval racing, today I'm going to analyse how Formula 1, and Formula racing in general, has appeared within the Gran Turismo games. Whether it be the cars, tracks, teams, or drivers, GT has a surprisingly rich history with Grand Prix racing, legitimate or otherwise. So, unlike most of these retrospectives, we're not going to start with the PS1 games. The reason why is very simple. There isn't much to talk about. Neither the original Gran Turismo nor its sequel include anything all that relevant to Formula 1. Really, the only exception to this comes in the form of the Renault Espace F1, a model that only appeared in GT2. This car was created by Matra by taking the Renault engine from the 1993 championship-winning Williams F1 car, along with F1-style suspension, and clothing it in a body shell that vaguely appears like a normal Renault Espace. In real life, it also appeared at select Formula 1 events as a promotional tool for Renault. So, whilst it definitely has some relation, it is far from an actual F1 car. Regardless, in GT2, it's still one of the fastest cars in the game, and is very fondly remembered by players. But with that said, let's fast forward a couple of years to Gran Turismo 3. Back in 2001, the internet was a very different place, with information not as easy to come by. Whilst it's very common to know almost everything about a game before it even comes out nowadays, that wasn't the case back then. Thanks to this, Polyphony were able to keep a pretty massive secret about the game completely hidden until it released. That being the inclusion of Formula 1 cars. These cars appeared in none of GT3's promotional material, and in-game they could only be unlocked from certain high-end events, such as the endurance races. In fact, the championship specifically for them would be obscured in the menus until you earn the necessary super license. However, the way in which they were first discovered is actually pretty funny. Japanese players were the first to get their hands on the game around the end of April, and very soon after, videos of the cars started surfacing on online message boards. You see, if you wait around on the main menu for a bit, the game will show you an edited replay, also known as an attract demo. It just so happens that replays with the F1 cars were included as attract demos, meaning that you could come across them within about a minute of booting up the game for the first time. Given how well concealed they are in the game aside from this, it kind of seems like a massive oversight by Polyphony. Unless it was intentional, but I don't really understand why they would do that. Anyway, when it comes to the cars themselves, you'll find 6 different models, and whilst each of them are fictional, they're all heavily inspired by real F1 cars, with their names even referencing this. The F686/M, for example, is Nigel Mansell's 1986 Williams FW11 powered by a V6 engine. And we can do this for the other cars as well. The F687S is Ayrton Senna's 1987 Lotus 99T V6. The F688S is Senna's 1988 McLaren MP44 V6. The F090S is his 1990 MP45 V10. The F094S is Senna's 1994 Williams FW16 V10. And the F094H is Damon Hill's version of that same car. Many of the liveries are also strongly reminiscent of their real-life counterparts, and the driver helmets also change depending on the car and livery combo. Many of these also appear to reference their real-life drivers, which is a pretty neat detail. But if, like me, you grew up playing the PAL version of GT3, these cars will probably seem a bit unfamiliar. That's because when the game was eventually released in PAL regions, these 6 cars were replaced by 2 others, the Polyphony 001 and 002. The reason for this change was due to fears that the fictional cars were a little bit too similar to their real-life basis, and with Formula 1 and all of its teams being predominantly European-based, there would be closer scrutiny on them. So, to prevent any legal action, Polyphony swapped them out for the cars we see here. These 2 models are based on the F094S and F688S respectively, but with various changes, most notably to the design of their front and rear wings, to make them appear more generic. It's worth mentioning that there is another F1 car left unused in the game, the 1998 McLaren MP4-13. However, it appears extremely unfinished and seems like it was only used for testing purposes, hence the word test appearing on the side pods in place of the usual West sponsorship. Not only did the Formula cars in the final game look different from one another, they also drove differently. Each of them had differing amounts of power and weight, and as such, different handling characteristics. We might take stuff like this for granted in current day, but back then this was a pretty neat detail considering that it would have been easy for them to make every car have the same specs, and not many people would have complained. My only complaint is that with a standard controller, GT3 has a very slight steering delay, which is most notable with faster cars like these. The easiest way to get one is by completing one of the endurance races, which gives you a 1 in 4 chance. As this is true for every endurance race, no matter the length or difficulty, this has some famously game-breaking implications. As you might expect, these cars are by far the fastest in the game and can be used to dominate almost any event they're eligible for. Only the late game races at the test course, such as Like the Wind, might prove difficult for these cars as they don't have incredibly high top speeds. But a circuit which these cars are a lot more suited to is Côte d'Azur. Making its debut in GT3, this is an unlicensed version of the Monaco Grand Prix circuit. Whilst it was planned originally for GT2, as we can see from early builds of that game, I've always felt like it was included here mainly to tie in with the F1 cars. After all, it was only the second real-world racetrack to ever appear in the series after Laguna Seca. But speaking of Laguna Seca, this track actually has a pretty weird F1-related Easter egg. If you head around to the penultimate corner, you can find transporters with liveries from 3 then-current Formula 1 teams, Sauber, Benetton, and Jordan. What's even weirder is that these trucks were also present in the same place in GT2, representing the same 3 teams. The massive difference in quality means that they must have been remodeled specifically for GT3. Of course, Laguna Seca has never hosted a Formula 1 event, which makes this inclusion all the more unusual. That said, it is one of the tracks you'll encounter in the Formula GT Championship. As you might expect given the cars, this event is one of the longest and toughest in the entire game, billed as the ultimate challenge of GT3. It's made up of 10 races, most of which last between 30 and 40 minutes. One interesting difference between the F1 cars and most other cars in this game is that they only have one tyre compound available, Racing Medium. This means that strategy isn't very important in this event, which I think is a bit of a shame. However, with this event, you're not forced to use a Formula car. In fact, the high-end prototypes like the Toyota GT1 or Mazda 787B are very much viable when upgraded. In the right hands, these cars can actually be faster than the AI, and the ability to use harder tyres means that you can also make fewer stops and beat them on strategy. Adding to my belief that Côte d'Azur was included mainly for the F1 cars is the fact that the final race of the championship which takes place here is noticeably longer, lasting 78 laps or about 90 minutes. In case you didn't know, this is the exact length of the real-life Monaco Grand Prix, so the comparison is obvious. Another reference to this is the Mistral 78 laps endurance race, however here you'll instead be up against prototypes and GT cars. So, whilst they weren't exactly central to the core experience, the Formula cars in GT3 were certainly a cool addition, an added bonus for only the most dedicated players. With Gran Turismo 4, Polyphony decided to wipe the slate clean. None of the F1 cars from the previous game made the transition, most likely thanks to those licensing concerns. But this didn't mean that they would abandon the discipline entirely. Enter the Formula Gran Turismo. Whereas the previous cars were just reskins of real F1 machines, the Formula GT was something more original. To the untrained eye, it might just seem like a generic version of a Formula 1 car of that era, but there's actually more to it. By the mid-2000s, real F1 cars were compromised in various ways to A. slow them down, and B. reduce costs. These came in the form of them being made narrower, having grooved tyres, and lacking any electronic driving aids. The Formula GT, on the other hand, has a wider track, slick tyres, driving aids, and a 3.5-litre V12 engine, at a time when real F1 cars were limited to 3-litre V10s. Essentially, it was the ultimate formula car, a vision of what F1 cars could look like if they weren't bound by a rulebook. These factors made it even faster than the F1 cars from GT3 and anything else in GT4, as it packed almost 900 horsepower and weighed only 550 kilos. Getting one, however, was also made more of a challenge, as your primary method involves winning the Nürburgring 24 hours endurance race. Of course, using B-Spec, this can be achieved in as little as 8 hours, but it will still take some time to get it. GT4 is the game that truly expanded the selection of real-world tracks, but alongside the returning Côte d'Azur, the only other then-current F1 circuit was Suzuka. Unsurprisingly, both of these tracks appear in the returning Formula GT World Championship. Whilst the general trend of GT4 is that the late-game championships are not quite as long and arduous as GT3's, this event is the one major outlier. Instead of 10 races, we now have 15. And where the race at Monaco was unique in the previous game by matching the distance of a real-life Grand Prix, that's now the case for all of them. In total, you're looking at about 22 hours of racing to beat it, assuming that you do all 15 of course. Once again, you don't have to use the Formula GT here, although it is recommended. Many of the races can be won by an experienced player using a top-end prototype, and the Formula GT again being limited to racing medium tyres means that there is a strategic advantage in doing this. But either way, beating this event is a true accomplishment. For achieving this, you're rewarded with another Formula car, much like GT3. However, in the original Japanese release of the game, this one comes in a special black livery. If you want this car in international versions, your only option is to 100% the game. I'm not really sure that a plain black version of a car you already have really matches the efforts, but okay. As the series moved into the PS3 era, many things would change. For one, Gran Turismo established a partnership with Ferrari, allowing cars from the brand to appear in these games starting with GT HD Concept in 2006. The following year would see the initial release of Gran Turismo 5 Prologue, and with it came the first officially licensed F1 car in the series. This is the F2007, Ferrari's championship-winning car that year. In-game, there are 4 livery variants: Felipe Massa's number 5 car and Kimi Raikkonen's number 6, each with bright red and darker metallic red versions. These reflect the 2 different colour schemes that were used during the season. Whilst this car was a pretty groundbreaking inclusion, especially seeing it in such high detail, including a fully modelled cockpit, in this game it really is just a novelty. Naturally, the car would be carried over into the full Gran Turismo 5, where it would be joined by one of its successors, the Ferrari F10. This was the 2010 machine driven by Felipe Massa and Fernando Alonso, which won 5 races that year and finished 3rd in the Constructors' Championship. But if the F2007 was just a novelty in GT5 Prologue, then that's true for both cars in the full game. Each of them have restrictions on which game modes they can be used in. For example, neither can be raced in any of the single-player career mode events. In fact, the only places they could be used were in time trial, one-make seasonal events, and online races, but only with a special setting that limited car choice to just them. With the servers now offline, time trial is the only way to drive these cars. I guess to some degree this was to be expected, especially since we're talking about Ferrari. But at the same time, in GT5 Prologue, the F2007 could still be driven on track with other cars. Considering that each of them cost 8-digit sums in GT5, it just seems really pointless. This is one of those cases where despite the cars being undoubtedly unique and interesting, the way they were implemented meant that nobody really cared. In current day, I find that people very rarely talk about these cars in GT5, and I don't think it's hard to see why. In fact, there are even more reasons why the Ferraris are completely overshadowed in this game. Firstly, we have the Formula GT returning from GT4, and not just that, but also its own dedicated championship. This event has been scaled back significantly from GT4 and even GT3, as it now comprises of 6 20-lap races. All of the circuits are either then current or recent F1 venues as well. Unfortunately, this being GT5, there is no tyre wear or fuel usage, but the final 2 races do have wet weather enabled, which is a fun challenge. When talking about this event, I'm mostly relying on my memories from when I first played it all those years ago. Why is that? Well, because Polyphony made quite an unfortunate design decision. Most of the cars that were carried over from the previous games, dubbed as standard cars, can only be bought from the used car dealership. However, there are around 800 standard cars and only a handful of spots in the used dealers, meaning that to find an exact car will take a huge dose of luck and most likely time. Unfortunately, the Formula GT is one of those cars, with a list price of around 5 million credits. And unlike the past games, you need to have it to enter this event. There is no other option. To their credit, Polyphony did recognise this problem and implemented the online collector's dealership, where rare cars such as the Formula GT were regularly stocked. But this feature relied on the internet, so with the servers going offline in 2014, we're back to square one. Man, I sure love temporary solutions to permanent problems. But hey, luckily the used dealers isn't the only way to get this car. You can also win it as a prize. All you have to do is win all 9 of the endurance races. Yep. So, all of this is to explain that on my current save, I don't actually have a Formula GT, and all the footage you're seeing has been recorded by other people. Still, it's not as if I'm missing out on any great prizes. For beating this event in A-Spec, you get a Caterham, and in B-Spec, the Suzuki GSX-R4. Remember what I said about the black Formula GT from GT4? Well, I take that back. To be honest, the biggest factor in why the Ferrari F1 cars get so forgotten is because, starting with GT5, Gran Turismo decided to collaborate with one of their biggest F1 rivals. 2010 was the year that Red Bull took their first ever Formula 1 titles, but it also saw the birth of the X2010. This was a radical prototype race car that was designed jointly by Gran Turismo and legendary F1 designer Adrian Newey, specifically to appear in the game. It utilised fan car technology and an engine making almost 1500 horsepower to achieve truly unbelievable speeds. Newey's brief with this car was to make the ultimate no-rules version of a Formula machine, which in some ways kinda makes it successor to the Formula GT, albeit far more extreme. Then Red Bull driver and 2010 world champion Sebastian Vettel was also involved, and you can even find him in-game through the Sebastian Vettel X Challenge. This is a special event that has you racing a ghost of him as you try to beat the target time at 3 different tracks. However, it's pretty infamous for being possibly the toughest event in Gran Turismo history. On a standard PS3 controller, the goal times are close to impossible, as the steering delay makes it extremely difficult to have the precision required for such a fast-moving vehicle. We would see more variations of the X2010 as time went on. For example, in October 2011, the Red Bull X2011 would be released as part of a DLC pack, essentially being an upgraded X2010 with slightly more power and revised aerodynamics. There would also be the very obscure Red Bull X2010 5G, a car that was created purely for a Japan-only esports event in 2012. Along with a few styling differences, it was massively detuned, making less than 400 horsepower and having its fan system disabled entirely. In many ways, it was a foreshadowing of what we would see in the future. Whilst most cars from GT5 would be carried over into Gran Turismo 6, that wasn't true for all of them. 2 of the most high-profile casualties were the Ferrari F2007 and F10, as their licenses had since expired. I would say that's a shame, but given that if they did make a return, their appearances would have likely been similar to how they were in GT5, it's not really a big deal. Regardless, what it meant was that at launch, GT6 had no real-world Formula 1 cars. The Formula GT, however, did return, looking noticeably sharper thanks to getting a semi-premium upgrade. It also received 6 new livery options, albeit the black design from GT4 didn't return. But the most important difference was that it was now available to purchase from the dealers at any time, and for just 2 million credits. All of these factors might make you think that they had big plans for this car in GT6, but that wasn't really the case. In fact, for the first time since its debut in GT3, there was no Formula GT Championship, which I personally think was kind of a waste. The Red Bull X cars from GT5 also returned, and soon we would get some more. The Red Bull X Challenge debuted in an update not long after the game released. It brought a revised X2014 version of the fan car with updated styling, but that wasn't all. There was also the Red Bull X2014 Standard and Junior. The former was essentially the fan car but detuned and with the fans removed, just like the X2010 5G, and the latter was a much more compact junior Formula race car. Both also came with their own 5 race championships featuring grid starts, something of a rarity in GT6. There was also a Red Bull themed kart event helping to create a sort of Red Bull X car ladder, kind of like real life Formula racing. And at the top, you would once again find Sebastian Vettel and his X Challenge time trials, although they were a fair bit easier this time around. By this point, the series had plenty of Formula 1 circuits, both past and present, many of which were used in the Red Bull events, but a couple of them were about to be made use of in quite a unique way. In May 2014, the Ayrton Senna Tribute Special event was added to the game, coinciding with the 20th anniversary of his death. Series producer Kazunori Yamauchi has long admired Senna. 4 of the 6 fictional F1 cars from GT3 were based on ones he raced after all, so this tribute was quite fitting. This mode included a handful of vehicles from Senna's career, from his 1980 DAP racing karts to his 1983 West Surrey Racing F3 machine, and finally the Lotus 97T that he used to take his first F1 victories in 1985. The event itself took the form of a series of time trials, but what made it even more unique was the tracks. Brands Hatch and Monza were the key focus, but they didn't just use the versions of them already in the game. Instead, they created specific 1980s layouts that depicted how they were back then. Thanks to this, they were then able to make the goal times for this event be the actual lap times that Senna himself set, which is a really cool detail. When combined with the slideshows detailing Senna's life and career, as well as the Ayrton's Wish documentary covering his legacy, it all makes for a really enjoyable tribute. For clearing each stage with gold times, you win the respective vehicle, but you can also get some of Senna's racing suits and helmets for your driver avatar. Interestingly, there's also his 1988 McLaren outfit which can be bought separately, despite said car not actually being included. Unlike the Ferraris in GT5, the Lotus 97T can actually be used more widely in the game, but as most of the events in GT6 are performance point limited, there isn't a huge amount you can do with it in the single player. In GT3, one of the fictional F1 cars was based on this car's successor, the Lotus 99T, but it did feature a colour scheme that referenced this car's black and gold John Player special livery, so its inclusion in GT6 kind of feels like a full circle moment. The series' transition onto the PS4 with Gran Turismo Sport represented a major shift in focus for the franchise. Structured single-player content suddenly became far less important, and in its place, a much stronger emphasis on competitive online racing was formed. To help with this, Gran Turismo had something up its sleeve. Not long before the game came out, Formula 1 world champion Lewis Hamilton was announced as the Maestro. But what did that mean exactly? Well, in short, he would be like a mentor for players, providing driving tips as well as reference laps to help them improve at the game. This was all part of Hamilton becoming a brand ambassador for the series, with Gran Turismo also sponsoring him in real life. As it turns out, he's actually a long-time fan of the franchise with fond memories of playing the original game back in the day, so the partnership just came naturally. However, as for GT Sport itself, there really wasn't any F1 related content to begin with. But with updates coming frequently, this didn't stay the case for long. In version 1.13, we were introduced to the F1500 TA. This car is effectively an unlicensed version of the Lotus 97T from GT6, in a similar vein to the F1 cars from GT3, although its name isn't as interesting. 1500T just refers to its 1.5-litre turbocharged engine. Performance-wise, it's pretty much identical to the 97T, and visually it isn't far off either. The car came in a variety of generic colour schemes, but with GT Sport featuring a livery editor for the first time, this allowed people to run wild creating replica designs. To go with it, the game would also receive the F1500 Championship event in the GT League mode, with more races being added gradually over time. And when it came to returning cars, there was then the Red Bull X 2014 Junior and Standard. There isn't too much to say as the cars returned pretty much as they were in GT6. However, it is worth noting that the X 2014 Standard became a very common sight in online sport mode races and live events, and it was races like these that inspired the X 2014 Nations Cup event in the GT League. However, Gran Turismo decided that the car could be made better for online racing, and so the X 2019 competition was born. This car is based on the X2014 but with various adjustments, including a reduction in downforce to reduce the effect of dirty air, and a naturally aspirated V12 engine for better sound. Thanks to this, and its subsequent appearances in the FIA live events, the X2019 competition became quite representative of GT Sport as a whole. It even appeared on the box art of the Spec 2 version of the game. In the GT League mode, it would also receive its own events, and in the Endurance series no less. Whilst the Gran Turismo Lewis Hamilton partnership produced nothing more than a few videos to begin with, that did eventually change. Firstly, in Update 1.23, his 2017 Mercedes W08 Formula 1 car was added to the game. This was only the 4th official F1 car in the series, and the only one in GT Sports. But much like the Ferraris, there were limitations. The car could not have custom liveries made for it. Whilst that was a big shame, they did at least include a second version of the car that featured a plain design with 11 different base colour options. It often gets overlooked, but being able to give these cars different colour schemes is a massive deal when it comes to one-make racing, where cars like these would naturally end up. This is another one of the reasons why the Ferraris and even the 97T were not popular for one-make online, since it's very boring when every car looks almost identical. Fortunately, the Mercedes doesn't fall into this trap, and that's just as well considering that it was sometimes used in sport mode and even has a one-make event in GT League. Up until now, I haven't commented that much on how these cars handle, as for the most part, whilst not being super accurate, they feel fine. However, the Mercedes W08 has always been quite off. This was especially apparent when they first added it. I remember that in some situations it was borderline undrivable. Through further updates they did improve it, but not without sacrifice. Now it kind of feels like it always has some form of stability control even when you have the assists off. Either way, this car clearly doesn't drive at all like the real thing. And I guess that's probably part of the reason why, despite being his World Championship winning car, it didn't feature in the Lewis Hamilton Time Trial Challenge. This was a paid DLC that released in November 2019, giving you access to 10 time trials. Almost all of them have you driving the AMG GT3, aside from the final one which puts you in a Sauber Mercedes C9 at the Nordschleife. Each of them includes a special diamond rank that can only be acquired by beating Lewis Hamilton's own lap time. Compared to the events in the base game, these are undoubtedly the toughest challenges you'll face. Personally, the one at Willow Springs is what took me the longest to beat, but with a bit of perseverance, getting all diamond is very doable. For achieving this, you unlock a video message from Hamilton, which you can no longer watch because it was tied to the servers for some ungodly reason, as well as a special version of the Mercedes Vision GT car, and a whopping 100 million credits. When you really think about it, by getting this DLC, what you're really paying for is the potential to earn this money and the other prize cars. I mean, let's be real, without that, this DLC that gives you access to some time trials and a version of a car that's already in the game was not worth $8, especially when so much more was given out for free. For me, it kind of falls in this strange grey area. It's not exactly the same as buying in-game money, but it still feels a bit weird. So far, everything we've covered has been related to Formula 1, but it's not the only major single-seater series to get representation in these games. GT Sports Update 1.36 added a car from the Japanese Super Formula Championship. This is a series that evolved from Japanese Formula 3000 into its own distinct thing, and outside of Formula 1, currently has the fastest racing cars on the planet. The model included here is the Dallara SF19 that debuted in the 2019 season. In real life, the series is a one-make championship, but with two different engine suppliers, Toyota and Honda, and in the game, this is represented as well. Other than engine sound, they're basically identical, and as the cars aren't affiliated with any single team, you could create liveries for them. We can see this in the Super Formula Championship event, where most of the opponents sport colour schemes that reference real Super Formula cars. One key feature of the car is the overtake system, which grants you a bit of extra power for a limited amount of time. I'm also pleased to say that the car drives considerably better than the Mercedes, although that isn't a high bar to clear. Really, it just makes me wonder how that car ended up as broken as it did. Whilst Lewis Hamilton reprised his role as the Maestro in Gran Turismo 7, this didn't prevent what almost felt like an inevitability from occurring. Much like the Ferrari F2007, F10, and Lotus 97T before it, the Mercedes W08 became a one-game wonder, as it did not carry over into GT7. By now, we were kind of used to this, but what was somewhat unexpected was that whilst the Mercedes Vision GT in its standard and racing series forms did make the transition, the Lewis Hamilton edition from the Time Trial Challenge DLC didn't. But in GT7, these cars were the exception rather than the rule. All of the other Formula cars from GT Sport did make it over. However, much like many other cars in GT7, to begin with, they didn't really have much purpose in the single player as there were no race events for them. But over time, this would change. Update 1.32 would see the addition of a Super Formula event, as well as the updated Dallara SF23 first used in the 2023 season. The liveries on the AI opponent cars again reference real-life teams, but a few also nod to cars from Ace Driver, a 90s arcade game that was published by Namco. Very interesting decision. It's also worth mentioning that in 2025, former Gran Turismo World Series champion Igor Fraga became a real-life Super Formula driver. He was an esports ambassador for the series prior to this, but with the help of backing from Gran Turismo, he was able to earn a full-time drive with Honda team Nakajima Racing. The livery of his SF23 was then shared in-game through an official Gran Turismo account. Even though they may be from different series entirely, it's very common to see people use the Super Formula cars as a basis for F1 replicas. I'll be honest, I've never really liked these. By nature, they always look kinda shoddy, no matter how much time or effort people put into them. But it could be worse, such as when people create modern F1 livery replicas on the older cars. Genuinely, I do not understand what compels people to do this, and how they can possibly think it looks good. Anyway, in the meantime, the Red Bull X 2019 competition continued to have a strong presence. It was still used regularly in sport mode and the GT Championship live events, and at the end of 2022, a version with a special livery was given out to players to celebrate the series' 25th anniversary. Eventually, in Update 1.40, it would get its own single-player event, the X 2019 Nations Cup. Both this and the Super Formula events are some of the tougher races in the world circuit, as tyre strategy plays a major role. However, as had become quite a trend in these games, they all feature drawn-out rolling starts that require you to make up a considerable amount of time on the leader. But since the AI is actually decently fast in these events, it's resulted in some of the races being notoriously hard. Of course, this wouldn't be a problem if they just used grid starts. You know, kinda like most real-life single-seater championships, including Super Formula. Given that Gran Turismo has an official partnership with the series, you'd think that they would be interested in providing an authentic view of it, but apparently not. Much like GT Sports, GT7 didn't have any officially licensed Formula 1 cars at launch, but that did eventually change. After the Lotus 97T, which then became the F1500 TA, another one of Ayrton Senna's cars would appear, his McLaren MP44. Powered by a Honda V6, this was the car in which he took his first F1 World Championship in 1988. You might also remember that it was the basis for the F688S all the way back in GT3, and Senna's racing suit and helmet from that year appeared in GT6. The Spec 2 update for the game brought a new set of Master licenses, and the final test, Master S10, involves a lap of Suzuka with this very car. This is incredibly fitting considering that Suzuka was the track in which Senna sealed his 1988 title, and if you can achieve all gold times, you even win the car as well. This is pretty cool, but what was arguably even cooler was the fact that despite being a real F1 car licensed from a real F1 team, you could make custom liveries for it. This opened the floodgates to many replica designs of rival F1 teams, and of course completely original ones too. And the real-life Formula 1 cars would keep on rolling. Update 1.29 introduced the Honda RA272. This car is a landmark machine in Japanese motorsport as it brought the country's first F1 race win, courtesy of Richie Ginther at the 1965 Mexican Grand Prix. Much like the McLaren, it also allowed for custom liveries. In Gran Turismo, it's also notable for representing a never-before-seen era of F1 in these games. Up until then, we'd only seen cars dating back to the 1980s, so the Honda was something quite different. But eventually, it would be superseded as the oldest F1 machine by the Mercedes W196R from 1955. To be specific, this was the car driven by the legendary Juan Manuel Fangio en route to his third world title, just before Mercedes pulled out of motorsport following the 1955 Le Mans disaster. Once again, this car can be repainted and have decals applied in the livery editor. So, Gran Turismo had added 3 real-world F1 machines from 3 different eras. But at the same time, Polyphony didn't abandon the idea of generic Formula cars either. The F1500 TA still appeared, and with update 1.55, it would get a successor. This is the F3500A. Whereas the previous car was based on the small displacement turbocharged F1 cars from the mid-80s, the F3500 was a 3.5-litre NA V12, heavily based on the machines from the early 90s. And whilst we know that the F1500 was based on one real car specifically, the F3500 was a bit more of a blank canvas. To further this point, the car was given a number of front wing, rear wing, and bodywork options that could be mixed and matched, helping you to both personalize it and also make more accurate replica liveries. In effect, it's pretty much the perfect car for fans of this era of Formula 1, and a massive contrast to some of the ones we've seen before. And that pretty much brings us up to current day. As it stands, GT7 has more Formula cars than any of the previous games. The rundown includes 3 real F1 cars, 2 generic F1 cars, 2 real Super Formula cars, and 3 fantasy Red Bull cars. However, for me, the question is never just about how many there are, but what you can actually do with them. Whilst the Super Formula cars and X2019 are decently catered for with single-player events, that's not the case for all of them. The F1500 TA, for example, can't really be used for much outside of one driving mission, even though it had its own entire event in GT Sports. And the F3500A isn't much better, only getting a couple of limited-time special event races, but nothing permanent. Beyond that, in the single player, you're pretty much just limited to making your own events for these cars in custom race. But the model that easily takes the cake for most pointless has to be the Mercedes W196R. Naturally, being a 50s F1 car, it's quite niche and doesn't really fit in anywhere, and yet it doesn't have an event specifically for it either. But at the same time, your only way to get it is buying it in the Legends dealership for 20 million credits. It's no exaggeration to say that literally the only reason why I bought this car is because I knew that I would be making this video at some point. Beyond this, I've driven it a single time. I know I'm beating a dead horse, but this pretty much sums up the Gran Turismo 7 experience. Formula cars are not an outlier in that respect. But when it comes to the games that actually make use of their content, we see how Formula cars can be used within the single-player career. I'll admit that I don't think cars like these really match the vibe of Gran Turismo. A game where you start off racing used hatchbacks and gradually progress from there feels a bit too distant from the regimented real-life Formula racing ladder. I think this is also the reason why kart racing has never really worked, because it's kind of at odds with the traditional GT career structure. It doesn't really fit in anywhere, so it's mostly just tacked on the side. Top-end Formula cars, when featured, do at least have a clear position in the performance hierarchy, as they're normally some of the fastest cars in the game. As such, I think the way that the PS2 games in particular handles them is the best. They're not really integrated within the main career path. You don't have to drive them to beat the game. Instead, they sit at the top of the pyramid as both an added bonus and also an extra challenge for only the most invested players. I really love how they went about this in GT3, not showing or talking about them before launch and just letting players find out for themselves. It's the sort of thing that just wouldn't work nowadays, unless you avoided the internet entirely. But I think this really speaks to how Formula racing is viewed by the series. Despite being some of the best and fastest cars in the game, they're not the stars of the show. That isn't the point of Gran Turismo. So, despite never being an official Formula 1 game, Gran Turismo has managed to feature various real-life Formula cars and collaborated with some of the most successful teams and drivers. It's a legacy that doesn't just represent the influence of Formula 1, but also the influence of Gran Turismo itself. But what do you think? In which game did you enjoy these cars the most, and what do you hope to see the series do with them in the future? Leave your comments down below. But for now, thanks for watching, and have a good one.